It's great to have so many people attend today, so thank you for your time to come to Janet's session. So I'm James, I'll be hosting Janet today. So my research mainly looks around physical activity interventions for people with physical disabilities. So I'm really interested in finding ways to help improve physical activity for people with different physical disabilities. I met Janet out in Canada in 2022 when I went to the SCAPS conference. Janet was really friendly, showed me around her university at the time and saw different parts of Kingston in Ontario, which was really nice. And it would be a great opportunity for Janet to come to the IES at Loughborough to show off the work that she's done over the last few years as part of her PhD. So over to you, Janet. Hope the presentation goes well.
Awesome. Thank you, James. Yes, so I'm Janet Lawson and here to chat today about research primarily from my master's and PhD program around classification as a factor that affects the quality of disabled athletes' experiences in sport. And these are all insights gained from my research program, which is guided by the Knowledge to Action framework. So in Canada, it is custom to acknowledge the territories and treaties for the lands that we live and work on as an act of reconciliation for the people and places that settlers, scholars inhabit. So I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge that this work was conducted on Queen's University lands, which is the photo that you see on the left. These are the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. And I'm now employed and living in Winnipeg, where the University of Manitoba is situated on Treaty 1 territory, the lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the homelands of the Red River Métis. So classification is many things. I'm sure most of you on the call or in the room are probably familiar. It is a system at its core of organizing competition. In the parasport context, this allows athletes with diverse disabilities or impairment types to compete with and against one another in a fair and equitable manner. For some, it can be a sport milestone, something that's very important in the development of their athletic abilities and their career. But what I'm interested in is that it's an important aspect of the experience in sport. So classification can be something that determines or influences the ways in which athletes experience their sport and the opportunities that they're able to pursue. However, most research to date has primarily focused on that first point. We have quite a large body of work that's developed a significant evidence base for the classification procedures that are undertaken, which is fantastic. That work supports the medical assessments that athletes undergo when they pursue classification. So typically we see classification as being something where athletes must acquire medical documentation of their impairment. Then prior to competition, they undergo medical assessments, physical assessments, so those are more sport-specific activities like rowing on an ergometer, and then are observed in competition by a panel of classifiers to determine where the right fit for them within the competition is. For the case of rowing, for example, this might end up looking like athletes being categorized as a PR1, 2, or 3, which indicates the level of functional ability that they have relevant to the rowing motion, regardless of what their underlying health condition or impairment is. When it comes to experience quality, however, much less is known. Research shows that athletes with disabilities or disabled athletes often report being judged while undergoing the classification process. There are strong senses of surveillance and a needing to prove oneself and one's disability that are reported in the literature. We've also seen that athletes' experiences within the classification context are greatly influenced by the classifiers that they work with themselves. So strong communication skills are present sometimes and are linked with positive experiences, but often athletes are maybe confused or don't understand and don't have the opportunity to ask questions about classification to the individuals that are classifying them. And this is linked to the fact that athletes really commonly don't understand the classification system in and of itself. Athletes are often confused about why they received the classification that they did, why their peer might be a different classification, and there are no clear channels to research or understand why this might be and to learn more. So my research program has three main aims. The first of which is just to understand participants in parasports experiences with classification. So how do athletes or coaches that get involved with parasport learn about and understand classification, and then what are their experiences like? Are they positive? Are they negative? And why so? The second is to look at the existing body of research and other resources that are available to get a better sense of what really is out there. As I mentioned, there's a limited body of research, but until now, it was fairly unclear how extensive that was. And then thirdly, throughout my PhD, I sought to develop and implement knowledge products that could help participants to navigate the parasport system, specifically classification, and to help guide administrators in managing this process. To achieve these aims, my research is guided by the Knowledge to Action framework. So developed by Graham and colleagues in 2006, the KTA proposes that firstly, knowledge is generated through inquiry. So this would be first generation research before it is synthesized and brought together. And finally, knowledge tools can be produced. These knowledge tools can then be put into action through the action cycle, wherein they're taken up by knowledge users or community organizations, adapted to the local context. Barriers and facilitators to their use are identified. The intervention or the knowledge tool can be adapted, its use monitored and evaluated, and so on. Notably, this framework is presented as a fairly linear circle. However, knowledge is not always created first through inquiry and then synthesized and then produced into tools and so on. You can move back and forth throughout the framework. And so the research that I'm presenting today is from both my master's and PhD. And indeed, I have moved throughout each of these cycles in between levels. That won't be presented. I've tried to keep it pretty clear and in stages here for you today, but if you have questions around the KTA framework, I'm happy to answer after. Important and essential to the KTA framework is working with community partners. So my research program was funded by MyTax Accelerate with support from the Canadian Paralympic Committee while I was at Queen's. And additionally, I worked closely with members of the Ontario Parasport Collective, a legacy initiative of the Para-Pan Am Games in 2015, as well as with sport organizations such as Boccia Canada and Athletics Canada, and the Canadian Disability Partnership or Participation Project, which is a partnership of government, academic, public, and private organizations seeking to promote accessible physical activity programs in Canada. So each phase of this study was both conceptualized with these community partners, as well as they participated throughout the implementation of the research program. So to begin with knowledge inquiry, I set out in late 2019 to interview athletes, classifiers, and coaches, and later administrators about their experiences. My approach for each of these separate studies was slightly different, but broadly speaking, I used a reflexive and interpretivist approach to analysis. And in total, I was able to speak with 18 athletes, 8 international classifiers, 13 coaches, and 6 administrators from 6 different national sport organizations in Canada about their experiences with classification. If we looked at athletes, the key questions that I wanted to answer were: how do athletes learn about classification? And what meaning do they ascribe to classification? So is this important for them, or what effect does this experience have on them? In short, I learned that athletes develop an understanding of classification by reflecting on themselves, on their relationship to others, and on the classification system itself, which I'll explain in a moment. The self would be referring to their body. So athletes would watch others in competition, maybe watch their peers in practice, and try and develop a sense of, do I look like them? Do I move like them? Is that a classification that I may get? Am I similar or different? To try and generate an understanding of where they might land within their classification system for their given sport. Athletes would reflect on the relationship with others in regards to how they experience the process of getting classified. This is primarily their relationship with their coaches and how the coaches were able to help prepare them for classification, as well as with classifiers. And then lastly, the classification system was reflected on to justify or explain the classification that they received. So if an athlete was potentially dissatisfied with their classification, they could attribute it oftentimes to the ways that the classification system is set up. All of this was shown to vary athlete to athlete, depending the significance of all of this was shown to vary athlete to athlete. So some perceived classification to be a very important sport milestone, while others said that it wasn't really a big deal. This is really portrayed by the quote from an athlete that I have on the screen, where this athlete said to me that they left their classification in tears in the car with their coach on the way home, saying, "Holy shit, I'm disabled." For this athlete, they hadn't reconciled their relationship with their chronic illness and their impairment as being a disability until they went through that process. For others, they found that the ways that they interacted with classifiers really negatively highlighted their disability. So this athlete in particular emphasized to me that so much of participating in sport is about empowerment and finding strength and being able to do the things that you want to do and set challenging goals and work towards those. And they found that although they had an acquired disability and they were used to being in a hospital setting and having their impairment evaluated, that it was really unnecessary and really demeaning to be put into an environment like that within the sporting context. And then lastly, athletes would reflect on the system itself when they said things like, "I was going from doctor to doctor, and it didn't really seem like it was about my health anymore. It was about getting the official diagnosis so I could be reclassified." This athlete had had a change in their functional ability, so they needed to pursue a new classification in order to maintain their position in sport. And they felt that the arduous process of going from appointment to appointment, paying money oftentimes to see doctors and travel and so on, was having a greater negative effect on their mental health and their overall well-being than the value of participating in sport at an elite or competitive level was providing them. Classifiers, similarly, I asked, how do you learn about classification? What is your role and how do you understand that, or how do you gain that understanding? And then what opportunities do you have to collaborate with others? You hold so much knowledge around classification. What do you do with that when you're not in the room classifying an athlete? So in terms of learning, classifiers showed that they learn in very similar ways to athletes. They would reflect oftentimes on their medical training, think about the skills that they have in their clinical practice as a physiotherapist or an occupational therapist. They would also reflect on the ability of others that they were in the room with. Many classifiers spoke to me about the importance of being able to challenge what the knowledge in the room and to say to their peers on the classification panel, "I don't necessarily think that's true. Maybe it's this way. Maybe it's a little bit different." And so they learned from one another throughout the experience of classifying. And then finally, they use the classification system, again, to justify outcomes. So classifiers spoke of referring to the classification system to mitigate conflict with athletes. So instead of answering questions around how and why decisions were made, they could refer to the rule book to alleviate any pressure off themselves and to put a close to the discussion. Throughout this, classifiers described themselves not in so many words, as being benevolent actors. There was very much an emphasis throughout our conversations on the need to pursue this volunteer work for the feel-good feeling that they have, because it was valuable and it was something that was of interest to them. Some examples of this is that classifiers spoke of belonging when they classify. So an interest in sport paired with extensive medical knowledge is not something that necessarily gets to be merged together and applied in one context every day. Classifiers found that this was a really unique opportunity to marry their skill sets and give back to their community. That idea of giving back was really emphasized by classifiers saying things like, "I'm totally dedicated to giving every athlete the best sport class they can possibly receive. We owe it to them, especially when they have disabilities." So here we can see that while they are trying to do good work and they're really enthused about participating in this process, there are elements of this disability first identity that are heavily cemented within the logic of classifiers working in this space. And then finally, we have an example of a classifier saying that they keep the conversation to a minimum, that they try not to dig themselves into a hole by discussing classification too much with the athlete. So they instead went on to describe how they refer to the rule book to alleviate any questions for themselves if an athlete is confused about their classification. Coaches, meanwhile, again, I asked, what is the role of a coach? How do you support athletes in this process? And what do you know about classification? How did you learn that? Coaches, unfortunately, mostly learned on the job. I had one person literally say that they felt like they were thrown to the wolves. They had no experience with classification when they started, and they lack resources to learn about it. So coaches spoke really highly of the mentors that they built, the mentorship relationships that they were able to learn from others who had been in the field longer, and gain lessons from them, as well as being able to work with athletes and ask athletes questions about their disability to gain a better understanding. But this took time. So both coaches and athletes themselves felt like it was kind of luck of the draw. If you have a coach who's experienced, you might get a good sense before classification of what your sport class will end up being. And if not, you could be totally left on your own. In terms of their role when it comes to working with athletes, coaches describe the need to prepare athletes for classification, to frame the results or the outcome, and to provide oversight. So this is something that we don't necessarily see in other aspects of sport, where coaches are acting almost like a referee to say, I'm there to make sure that it goes okay, that nothing goes amiss, and that it's done by the book. One coach said, we just kind of learned from going through the process, doing it over and over with different athletes, different abilities, different levels of the same disability. So again, we can see that that coaches very much relied on their own experiences, which is great if you're able to work with a variety of athletes. But this also meant that some coaches, if they only worked with athletes with similar types and levels of disability, had very limited knowledge that might not be applicable to other athletes with whom they would work. Another coach shared, if the athlete is going in and they think they're a high class and they might not be eligible, I speak with them beforehand and I speak with the parents, and I outline essentially that if they're deemed as not eligible to participate based on their classification, it doesn't mean that we're saying they don't have a physical disability or a physical impairment. It's just a reflection of the system. So this is speaking to their need to prepare the athlete for any possible outcome from classification and really set their expectations low in advance to try and alleviate any potential disappointment that that athlete might feel pending a negative outcome. Coaches also spoke of being very selective with the meets that they send athletes to when they're trying to get an athlete classified. So while classifiers do go through training that is governed internationally, and they are supposed to be of a very high caliber throughout, there were impressions that the quality of the classifiers and therefore the quality of the experience that the athlete would have would depend on where you were going. And certain meets were thought to have more well-trained and well-prepared classifiers that would give your athlete a better shot of getting their best possible classification. Here, the classifiers shared. And so we're very careful to find classifiers who are experienced and favorable for the type of impairment that we're dealing with. Some people don't understand cerebral palsy to the point that we would like them to. So when we're looking at an international classification opportunity, we will often try to find someone who has more experience with those athletes because it is far more complicated to classify them. And we want to be sure the athletes are classified fairly. So this really rolls into the idea that they're both trying to advocate for their athlete and help get them the best outcome possible and also ensure fairness, making sure that it is going to be advantageous to everybody there by being selective about where they're sending their athletes. The final group that I spoke with were sport administrators. So I was able to speak with 6 administrators, and I understand potentially there might be some nuanced differences in the UK with how sport systems are set up. But in the Canadian context, sports are governed nationally, and then we'd have provincial governing bodies, and classification usually lays at that national level. Sport administrators said similarly to coaches that they had little to no formal training available. I spoke with one administrator who said, you know, I've been involved with parasport for going on 10 years, and I only really recently learned the difference between the social and medical model of disability. There is just a very basic lack of understanding that is available to them unless they're going to do work on their own time to pursue continuing education. The most notable finding from this study was that the purpose of classification seems to differ between people and between organizations. So while yes, of course, classification is meant to provide equal and fair competitive opportunities, some administrators hold the view that that is the case and classification should be reserved as long as possible, only send athletes to get classified when they're really far down that competitive path and they need this in order to participate. Whereas others said, yes, it creates fair competition opportunities, but as an organization, I have to think of the resources that I have. And I'm not going to invest money and time and training into an athlete unless I know that they're going to be in a classification that is advantageous, that they'll be competitive internationally. So we want to classify them as soon as we can, as early as we can in their sport career, before we're willing to put that time and money into them. Accordingly, the roles that the administrators take on within their organizations differed. So if you have an organization where the administrators feel generally, we just want people participating in sport, we don't really care if they get classified until they're at that international level. They didn't really deal with classification very much. It was something that they didn't have as a clear part of their portfolio. Whereas for other organizations where it was a more prevalent topic, something that came up quite frequently, this was something that was more well-defined. There were clear tasks related to classification that were under their purview that they worked with regularly, so they could speak more in depth to classification and how they supported it. We see these two contrasting ideas here with one administrator that said, as far as classification goes, we don't do national classification. The fields are so small that we've got away from it. There's no real need. Classification itself doesn't change anything for the athletes in the actual training environment. So we don't leave it, we don't do it when you're, we only leave it for when you're actively competing. Versus someone that said the other piece is to try to get a provisional classification before the athlete gets nationally classified. So speaking to classifying earlier or as early as possible. This will be the first time that they formally get seen so that we can avoid someone coming to nationals even, not even internationally, but national competition and being deemed ineligible, which we've had issues with in the past, and that's very upsetting. And understandably, no one would wish for an athlete to hope to compete and show up at an event, especially in Canada, where you've probably traveled very far to get to, and to be told that they're not going to have that opportunity. So there are valid reasons for both, but the administrators were very ambiguous as to what the purpose was. There was no clarity or clear vision statement within a single organization of that this is what we're doing. Again, it was really dependent on that administrator's experience and what they thought was best. So the athletes were once again left with whoever's experience they happen to meet with and see to influence their experience quality. So in short, all parties lack educational resources related to classification. There is a shortage of understanding of what goes into classification, what you need to do to prepare, and who to talk to about that. Good communication is essential. This I would love to say it would be a no-brainer, but there are so many instances of poor communication resulting in a negative experience for an athlete. In another case, someone told me that they had expressed to classifiers during their classification that they were at the end of their range of motion and that they were experiencing pain. And the classifiers didn't believe them and kept pushing until they ended up leaving classification with an injury that they hadn't gone into the room with. So if we can improve communication between athletes and classifiers, we can hopefully avoid or mitigate those types of issues and improve their experiences. And then again, with some of the language that we saw classifiers using, It's clear that very ableist narratives are prevalent within the context of classification. There are strong ideals around what the body should do and how it should function when we're looking at these bench tests that are completed. And I think there needs to be more work done around how can we test athletes in a way where we're holding up a normative standard and we are trying to fit someone into a box which is very concrete, but communicate it in a way to them that is respectful of their own identity and how they perceive themselves and their disability, so that they don't leave feeling like they've been alienated and really put into a vulnerable position going through this process. What would help with this is if organizations could be more clear on what the purpose of classification is. So if across the board we said, athletes don't need to participate in anything related to classification, just come out, have fun until you're really reaching for a competitive level, we would maybe be able to put more work into preparing resources around classification for those athletes that are a little bit older, who have more sport experience and are maybe more mentally prepared to go through these processes. Or conversely, if we agree, classification is really important because it unlocks so many resources, how can we frame it in a way that isn't going to deter people from participating? Because at its worst, athletes do report leaving sport in part because they get a sport class that leaves them not in a super competitive position. And then also just because it was such a negative experience that they don't want to go through it again or risk having to be involved in classification. So with all of these learnings in mind, I next moved through to the knowledge synthesis phase of the knowledge to action framework. So to supplement this first generation knowledge of the interviews that I was able to conduct, I did a scoping review of literature and a systematic online search. So I used 4 different academic databases, as well as hand searched the archives of Adapted Physical Activity Quarterly to look for publications related to classification and those experiential elements or aspects of classification, and pull data regarding the study characteristics, the methods, the scope. So looking at the population, the number of participants that they had, and so on, to get a sense of what work is being done in this field. For the systematic online search, I conducted a Google search emulating that of a typical user. So I looked at the first 100 results, which is actually more than most people spend time going through on Google, I learned. And looked at anything that popped up with a series of search terms around classification, parasport, disability sport, and so on. And I would pull data regarding what sport was targeted in the web page or the resource, who the target audience was, the domain of focus of the resource, so whether or not it provided information or instruction related to interpersonal elements, so behavior and relationships between persons, intrapersonal elements, so psychological training or psychological skills that can help prepare an athlete for classification, and technical knowledge related to the how, what, where, when classification takes place. And then I also looked at the Journal of the American Medical Association benchmarks for technical quality. So whether or not these web pages had information relating to who published them, who the author was, when it had been produced, and so on. I was able in total to look at 21 articles, and just under 100 results were relevant from the web search. The 21 papers that were published were primarily done from 2019 onwards, so about 67% of them, which really reflects a growing interest in this topic, which is exciting to see. 62% of the studies included athletes as participants. That's encouraging, as those are the primary individuals that we're seeking to serve when we're involved in parasport. But the fewest, or the group of individuals that were most seldom involved in these studies were classifiers. And again, we know that classifiers hold a significant amount of knowledge regarding classification. So it would be great to see more classifiers involved in research in the future. For those online resources, they were relatively low quality. Few had clear information about when they had been published or who produced them. The majority were from sport organizations. So those would be things like Paralympics Australia, the Canadian Paralympic Committee, the British equivalent, and so on, or different national sport organizations. And what you see here is the two examples on the screen of classification 101 and kind of what are the eligible impairment types, or the most common types of information available. So if you're to sit down and look online and say, I'd like to learn about classification, what is it? How do I go about getting classified? That is the bulk of what you'll see, is if you have one of these 10 impairment types, you're eligible. This is the basics of, it's a system for organizing competition. There was no information that I found related to what sort of intrapersonal or psychological skills training would be required to be mentally ready to undergo classification. And very few resources that I found provided instruction on how to communicate between athletes and classifiers. Some did, but it was very limited to, you should explain this to an athlete. So more resources or future resources should really consider moving beyond this technical information to include more intrapersonal and interpersonal information about the topic. But again, it's exciting to see an emerging interest, at least on the academic side. So moving to knowledge tool production, I worked with a consensus panel of 8 individuals, many of whom were athletes, had classifier certifications themselves, or were otherwise coaching parasport, to take all of that information from those interviews and from that systematic search and scoping review and synthesize this into recommendations for how we can manage and support classification better. At the beginning of this process, I had anticipated that we'd be developing resources to support coaches, but the consensus panel decided through conversation that targeting sport administrators would actually be more effective. Sport administrators are better positioned to control the flow of knowledge and to really relay information to all coaches and therefore all athletes, as opposed to working with individual coaches who might only be able to share information within their limited networks. I also was able to circulate our draft recommendations to 34 individuals online who were able to provide feedback on the clarity and comprehensiveness of the recommendations. And while they didn't provide very in-depth responses in our open-ended text box about the content of the recommendations, there was an overwhelming agreement that they were relevant and necessary things to implement within the parasport context. The reason for doing it this way and for going through this process is that evidence-informed recommendations are able to include both firsthand lived experience and knowledge, as well as research-based evidence. So given the limited nature or the small body of research on the topic, this was a way to expand on that and include expert opinion as well. And then it provided us with a framework for evaluating the quality of the process of tool development. So I used the Agree To instrument by Browers et al. To map out the scope and purpose of the recommendations, involve knowledge users throughout their development, evaluate the rigor of the process, and so on. In total, the consensus panel that I brought together developed 7 recommendations for classification. Each recommendation includes information on who, what, where, when, and how classification should be managed, or how the recommendation rather should be managed. Some also include example strategies that could be put into place. The list in total, on the board here or on the screen, you see the first recommendation, which is that national sport organizations should have adequate financial and human resources to support classification. Again, one would hope that this would be a fairly obvious recommendation, but it is something that is lacking. Most organizations that I've spoken with at least have said that there is much that they would like to do to support classification, but that they are limited in their financial and human resources, so they're not able to do so. The remaining recommendations speak to providing staff or volunteers with disability awareness training. So having staff have a better understanding of different models of disability, types of disability language that can be used and why, and so on, as well as better understanding the classification system relevant to their sport in and of itself. I can also provide the full list of recommendations afterwards if anyone is interested. So now that the recommendations are out in the world, I worked with 2 organizations to implement them and begin the stages of the action cycle. So I worked with both a small parasport specific NSO as well as a large integrated NSO in Canada. And to implement the recommendations, I used the organizational readiness for change questionnaire to develop an interview guide or a conversation framework to help plan out how the implementation should go. So the organizational readiness for change questionnaire asks questions around change commitment. So thinking outside of oneself, but as a collective, as an organization, it would ask questions like, can your organization manage implementation of this recommendation? Does your organization have the motivation to implement this recommendation? And then it would also ask questions around change efficacy. So does your organization have the capacity to implement this recommendation? Does your organization have the staffing and the time and so on to implement? So while this is a questionnaire that's typically presented as a Likert scale, where you'd have individuals respond, I use this just to frame a conversation. So we had a one-day meeting with each organization where we walked through these questionnaires and would sit in a group and speak about where that organization was at in terms of each of those 7 recommendations. So for the first case, the small parasport specific NSO, we began the day by talking about how we'd like to come to consensus as to whether or not they were ready to implement the recommendation and what their commitment to it was. And this organization decided that they liked to go by the model of, can I live with this? If everyone at the table said, yeah, I can live with this, that was a way for them to decide we don't have to all get our #1 top choice, but if it's something that is more or less agreeable, we can move forward. In total, they had high or reflected a high degree of change commitment. So the members of this organization that I was able to speak with were very motivated to implement the recommendations. They were excited about the opportunity to participate in this project. However, they were limited by their capacity. So they had, I would categorize this maybe as like a medium change efficacy. There were certain recommendations where they said, yes, we can totally do that. We maybe already have things in the works that would align with this recommendation. And then there were other things that they said, this is going to be too costly for us. We're a small organization. We don't have the capacity to do that. Part of this being a study is I was able to offer financial assistance to each of these organizations to implement the recommendations. And that was a huge win for this organization. They said, not telling us was really good because then it didn't bias us as we went through this process. We walked through evaluating what their readiness for change was prior to disclosing that the funds were available. But we were able to develop a solid plan for implementation based on their current resources and then chop that up. So they've been able to implement, I believe, 5 of 7 of the recommendations at present, and we're still working together to implement the final 2. For the second organization, which was a larger and integrated sport organization, they had a more fluid decision-making process. However, in our meeting, while I was working with individuals who are directly responsible for classification within their work portfolio, they themselves don't hold decision-making authority, particularly around finances within their organization. So they could come to agreement on things that they wanted to be implemented, should be implemented, that they had a high degree of motivation to implement or high change commitment. But in terms of change efficacy, they were a little bit limited in, sometimes they would have to say, we agree that this should be done. Here is the timeline that we could do it on, but we need to wait for so-and-so's approval. We're going to have to bring this to the board and so forth. The other interesting finding from this organization is that while it was a bigger NSO, they seem to actually have less capacity in terms of human resources. So their time was more limited, especially coming into a Paralympic year. We would email, I believe I started emailing with them in January of 2023, and I met with them for the first time in August of that year. So it'd be the type of thing where we would email back and forth a bit, and then I wouldn't hear from them for 2 months, and then we'd be able to meet. So, a lesson for myself at least was when you're working with sport organizations, and I mean, I knew this beforehand, but it was really cemented, is you need to be aware of the quadrennial and where they are in their sports season and the sports cycle, because you just won't hear from them if it's competition season. So the key takeaways here, time and money are important. It is necessary for classification to be adequately supported. That is both a recommendation and also the biggest challenge or barrier to implementing the other recommendations is whether or not an organization has enough financial resources and human resources to support it. Small actions, though, can have a really big impact. So I was able to support each organization with 5,000 Canadian dollars. That's roughly 2,500 pounds. It's not a huge sum of money, but that made a percentage difference in their budgets that was specifically designated for classification. That was enough for them to send someone to training to become a classifier or to host a workshop. And even just taking that one day to sit down and action plan how they would go about implementing the recommendations. They had said, you know, it was only one day. It took us forever to clear our calendars to do this, but now that this is one day done, we have a clear plan and we know where each action is going to fit in our daily schedule so that this work gets done. So it doesn't take a ton of time to do. Within each organization, classifiers were involved in the implementation process. So we had the lead classifier for each sport present, and that was really essential. They were able to provide us insight into, yes, this can be implemented this way because it aligns with the code book for classification versus no, we shouldn't do that because it might bump up against other thing or we're limited in this way. They just had a better insight into what the classifiers in the country were doing. So I'd say for any organizations that are thinking about implementing these recommendations, getting buy-in from their classification leads is going to be essential. So if we go back to the purpose of my research program, to understand parasport experiences, to assess current resources and research, and to develop and implement knowledge products that can help support participants. What I've developed over the last 6 years is an idea that quality interpersonal relationships and adequate education are essential to athletes having positive experiences within classification and therefore within parasport. We also see a growing but limited interest in classification. So I hope that if I'm to give this talk again in 5 or 10 years, there will be even more people online and even more people in the room. And although I do appreciate you all being here today, so hopefully we'll see some familiar faces then as well. And then lastly, organizations are keen to make changes. There is an appetite for this type of change and to think beyond what are the evidence-based procedures that we're doing for classification. But time and money really limits the ability of these organizations to make some of those subsequent changes. So rethinking the asks that we're putting on organizations as we do research, thinking how we can provide them with support in turn, in my experiences, has helped to create fruitful research relationships where both the NSO is then getting something out of it in terms of the recommendations and the support implementing them, and I'm able to conduct my research. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to questions.